Welcome back, everybody. And let me just begin by thanking everyone that has been associated with putting today's program together. And the next panel will be that of an overview of public and private carbon offset market opportunities, methodologies, and constraints. My name is Marc Pacheco. I'm the CSG chair of the State Legislative Climate Alliance, and I represent Southeastern Massachusetts. We have so many legislators that have signed up from throughout different parts of the U.S. for today's conference. And one of the issues that has been ongoing for some time, in particular way out west in California, where we have a cap and trade program that is the one place in the U.S. where there's actually a compliance market that is in place. And other places have many voluntary offset markets that have been growing rapidly, and that's what today's panel will primarily focus on. We have two panelists, one Aaron Paul and Cindy Cheng, two of the panelists that we will talk with at this point in time. Aaron joined Bluestone in 2019 to lead forest carbon transactions across North America as Director of Forest Carbon Origination. Aaron works with timberland managers to realize new revenue streams from voluntary and compliance markets. Prior to Bluestone, he ran transactions for the Nature Conservancy in Washington State for 4 years. Aaron lives with his family in North Seattle and gets back to his home in the state of Maine whenever he can. Next, we will have Cindy Cheng, who is a sustainability and climate change expert with nearly 10 years of experience connecting private sector financing, philanthropic funding, and public policy with effective climate change solutions. As head of partnerships and sustainability for Pachama, and you'll have to tell me if I'm pronouncing these things correctly, Cindy, as we move forward. Cindy works with companies to integrate Pachama's forest carbon platform and technology into their business models to achieve their climate markets. I am extremely excited about the whole issue of carbon markets and the way we can work on these markets, in particular as we see what the Biden administration has been putting forth over the last few days, and how we're seeing the discussion of actually having markets created, even with the federal government funding some resources for farming and for regenerative farming, for creating carbon sinks throughout the country, and in ways in which we can utilize the significant new involvement from companies like Amazon and so many others that are looking to invest and buy these credits. To talk about it in general, I would ask both of you to talk about it a little bit in general and realize that you're talking to a lot of us in the legislature from throughout the country that may need just a little bit of explanation as to how the fundamentals of the carbon market works, and also touch on the question that has been brought up with some other panels, and that is, how do we get to carbon negative on the carbon markets? Because if we're just replacing we're just buying the credit and we're really staying carbon neutral, then how do we get to where we need to be? The new announcement coming out trying to halve the carbon emissions that we have right now by 2030. As a country, that's going to be quite a challenge, and we need to get a big piece of it right within this sector. So let me start off with whoever wants to go first, Aaron or Cindy. Aaron, and I start with you.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's always fun to get to talk to the legislators and civil servants who are on the bleeding edge of making climate policy happen. I tend to only get involved after the policy is not only passed the various state houses, but written into law and a few years into the testing. So this is really great to get involved at this stage. Just gonna share some slides.
There you go. We can see them.
Fantastic. So today I just want to talk about a few things, what the existing carbon market opportunities are today, and what are some sort of core elements that a firm like Bluesource looks for in order to bring capital to private landowners who are looking to do good things for the planet. So my company is an environmental attribute developer. We're among the older in the business. We've been around 20 years. And basically what this means is that when policymakers or voluntary corporate entities want to send a market signal, want to make some environmental impact through pricing, through creating demand and supply, we are the people who listen to that signal. We listen to that signal and then we go and try to change behavior throughout whatever marketplace that's trying to influence. I'm a forester by training, also have a degree in finance. So I focus almost exclusively on our forestry work when learning more and more about regenerative agriculture. In addition to that, we also work in areas like fugitive methane emission reduction. So we work with natural gas pipeline managers or even the extractive industries at the very top of the oil and gas supply chain to minimize methane leaks in their system, usually in Canada where it's heavily regulated. We also do a great deal of work in the low carbon fuel market in the US, particularly around dairies and municipal wastewater treatment plants, which can create a renewable natural gas, very similar to conventional natural gas and energy equivalent. This is where we work in the forest space. We are kind of unique among the different firms you might run across in that we've always had a very large presence in the compliance markets, like creating projects that sell credits into California and Quebec's cap and trade system, which Washington State actually just passed a bill to join, or at least to create an equivalent cap and trade system yesterday. The House just passed it, so we're very excited about that. And what we've also developed projects for the corporate voluntary market going back to 2005, and you see this cluster of projects in coastal North Carolina. Those were our first, and those have been selling offsets to corporations on a voluntary basis for 15 years. It's not a great map, but this is where our renewable fuels work takes place. And what we do is we will actually work with the producer of the supply, so a dairy farm, wastewater treatment plant, gasify it, convey it to a clean natural gas fuel station, and create the tradable credits that go along with that, the LCFS credit, and sell that in California. So I'm going to dwell on forest carbon and touch just a little bit on agriculture because, well, forests are what I know. Basically, you just need to know two things. There are two very active markets in the US right now. There's a compliance market and the voluntary market. Voluntary markets are driven by corporations who are under some sort of pressure from investors, executives, employees, you name it, or they can be nonprofits as well, to reduce their emissions or even eliminate their carbon footprint over their history. Pricing's it's highly variable. We transact anywhere from $8 to $15 in the course of a year. Generally, pricing is between $6 and $12 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Also, buyers like to see projects that are close by. They like to have that direct environmental benefit. They like to buy projects in their state. That's part of why we cast such a wide net. Compliance market, totally different animal. These are regulated emitters in California and Quebec. They look like fuel producers, refineries, large utilities, anyone who you can think of who would be emitting a great deal of CO2. And they can meet a portion of the regulatory obligation, very small portion, it's 8% dropping to 4% in California, while staying at 8% in Quebec, through the purchase of offsets. The idea being that if we're going to have a price on carbon, some of the funding should go toward programs that don't just price CO2. They create some sort of co-benefits. So forests produce water, they provide habitat, they provide recreation, they provide sustainable fiber use. So by protecting them, we create these other co-benefits. Similarly, destroying ozone substances like CFCs protects the ozone layer and reduces the risk of cancer. Pricing's around $12.50 today, but going up. And the credits are almost completely interchangeable. Credit from a forest project is just as good as a credit from a mine methane capture and destruction project. And something I find is often lost in the various coverage of this market is just how significant it's been for forest protection in the US. So on the left-hand side, we just have a graph in green of what the total value of offsets transacted in each year, so going back to 2013 has been when the program went live. And in the last 4 years, it's averaged about $400 million in proceeds to forest landowners across the country. Now, for context, that's about what the Land and Water Conservation Fund is, the primary vehicle for land conservation in America, the primary federal vehicle, at least until the North American Great Outdoors Act was passed last year, which dramatically increased it. But historically, this was big. This covered 6 million acres. It's provided a tremendous amount of funding to conservation groups to protect more land. It's about half of this money, about half of all offsets have been issued to Native Alaskan or Native American projects, which have used the funds for a variety of purposes, including repurchase of ancestral lands that have been lost from Native American ownership over the course of centuries. Well, that's been fun to be part of. And yes, and we also work with some very wealthy families to make them a bit wealthier through this market too. And even at this level of funding, it's important to note that this only represents about 4 to 5% of the WCI's total emissions. So for a little bit of offset allocation, it's a pretty big impact. The Senator mentioned the voluntary market. Now, this is something that's coming along very fast. It's been sort of somewhat modest amount of funding, but an important amount of funding for different conservation groups predominantly over the last few years. But as of 2020, we've just really seen a surge in interest. And I still don't really understand what sparked it in 2020. There's always been a sort of healthy dialogue around nature-based solutions, but it really just picked up last year on a transactional basis. And we saw it, our best guess, and this is really my company's own internal numbers, is that we hit about $40 million in total forestry voluntary transactions in the US, and expect this will go up again. At the bottom, you'll see a list of some of the corporations who have signed on to net zero emissions pledges, and this is just a snapshot. As near as we can tell, there are about 2,500 different entities that have made these commitments, and a subset of those are using offsets to meet a portion of their need. So this is all great at the macro level. I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like for the actual landowner, particularly in the Northeast. Because I get this question every week, most days of the week is, all right, thank you for the mechanics, thank you for the overview, how much can I actually make? And the answer is it depends entirely on how well the forest is stocked, but generally speaking, a landowner somewhere between northern Pennsylvania and Maine, if their forest is stocked to the tune of 10 cords per acre, which is what you see in a place that has a history pretty heavy industrial management, they can earn about $75 per acre over the course of 10 years. And that's entirely driven by growth. That is just CO2 being taken out of the atmosphere and put into trees. That's $75. When you actually get to higher levels of stocking, forest landowners can receive money to protect that existing stocking, particularly when they get to be really exceptional forests, like this 35 cords per acre forest I almost never see in New England just because of the land management history, but which would occur naturally if just let it run its course. Then in that case, the markets will actually pay them close to $1,000 an acre, and most of that very early on in the project process, which is roughly what the land would sell for. The markets are that's a long way to say the markets are pretty motivated to keep exceptional forests as exceptional forests and not changing into something else. Now, this is a quick discussion on why we're seeing real uptake in the voluntary market and in the compliance market too. Because in these areas that were historically managed for pulp and paper, and that have seen a large exodus of pulp and paper mills, carbon is pretty price competitive. If you're managing a forest based on sustained yield, if you're really not trying to dig into the existing stocking and deforest it, then on a per cord basis, a cord of say mixed hardwood, which is very carbon dense, will get you a cord of growth, will net the landowner about $18. And that's after all fees, all transaction costs, everything. They're getting $18 just to leave that in the forest. If they cut it down in Maine, as of last year, they make about $8. In New York, in the Adirondack region, they make about 12. So we're starting to really get competitive with the historical log markets in these areas. Now, once you let the trees grow longer and they become saw logs and they receive 10 times as much, different story, but these forests are predominantly pulp, so the saw log opportunities are kind of limited. Now I'm going to go out on a limb because I know it was interesting and talk a bit about the agricultural opportunities that we're seeing. First, renewable natural gas, which I touched on. There are a number of jurisdictions in the US and Canada that have low carbon fuel standard mandates. This basically means that fuel producers have got to blend in a low carbon footprint type of fuel. They determine what average carbon intensity the fuel producers have to meet via statute, and that is typically a little bit less carbon intensive than natural gas, declining over time. And so one of the ways that we love to help them meet this is to take dairy waste and gasify it, because it has a very high carbon footprint if it's just left to lagoon, and a very low carbon footprint if it's turned into gas. And for those types of farmers who we can identify, they look to earn about $600 per cow per year just from the sale of gas and the sale of the credits. For context, that's about 20% of what they make from milk in the state of Vermont. Soil carbon. It's almost embarrassing that it took the carbon developers and the carbon methodology authors this long to come up with a set of rules for quantifying soil carbon in a way that we could sell credits around it. But last year, we finally got around to doing it, despite literally millennia, as our panelists before mentioned, of knowledge and understanding of how regenerative ag works and why it's a good idea. But we now have those methodologies hot off the press, and we're even starting to see funding go directly to the farmers. And from what we can tell, just for sort of relatively low cost interventions like switching to cover crops or switching to no-till or reducing nitrogen-based fertilizer use, this can generate about $15 to $35 per year per acre for the farmers. So it's a meaningful amount of money, and that number can go up a lot depending on the additives that they're using that also boost carbon sequestration. So I was asked to give some recommendations, and I think I would categorize them. I'm running short on time. in just a handful of items. So one, the private sector, and if you want the private sector to bring capital to this issue and not to address it through a regulatory mechanism, we like the following things, like consistency. So we like it when states work together to have a single marketplace. We like that. We like scale. That goes along the same vein. And we like reasonable prices. Don't like rapidly increasing prices. It leads to market disruption and some bad acting. We like fair prices that behave predictably. And the good news is that there are a lot of standards out there to work with, to build programs around, and here are just a few of them. The other point I would make is to say, use the policies that already exist. Try not to start from scratch when it comes to building partnerships. And something I would like to leave the group with is that if one of your goals is to direct funding to nature-based solutions to climate change, you already have a mechanism in place. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative does have an offsets provision that includes a largely identical methodology to California. It's never used. It's never been used. And the reason why is this chart here. Because a forest landowner in Maine can make 5-10 times as much money selling an offset into California versus Reggie, so no one does it. If the pricing were to change, the behavior would change too. And all of the projects that I listed on one of the earlier slides on that map are producing offsets more or less every year as they let their trees grow. So there is this existing supply of emission reductions that are just going right to California, right in your backyard. So that could change just with this framework. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very, very much, Aaron. That was, excuse me, that was fantastic. In particular, the last suggestion about the Reggie, market. I think a lot of legislators are very familiar with Reggie, but not familiar with the specifics in terms of the carbon market pricing that could be put into a system that we're all trying to deal with our own legislation. But we want to come back to you in just a minute. I want to turn it over to Cindy for her presentation. Cindy.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Senator, for the introductions. My name is Cindy Cheng, so you pronounced it correctly. And I will share my screen here in a second. Can you all see the deck?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Let me change this to full screen mode, if it will work. Okay, there we go. Great. So thanks again for the invitation to join this panel. Really excited to be here and spend Saturday morning with you all. My name is Cindy Cheng. I head partnerships at Pachama. So I'll kind of dive a little bit more into the voluntary space, building off of what Aaron shared with us on both the compliance and voluntary market lenses. So Pachama, we're a technology company. We're a startup founded 2.5 years ago, really thinking about ways that we can harness advancements in technology and data to support scale in carbon markets. I think something that we found is, realizing forests represent 37% of the climate mitigation opportunity in front of us between today and 2030. But being a climate solution that's really only getting 2% of the funding today, our goal is really one aimed towards how do we figure out ways to efficiently channel private sector finance directly to the landowners who are doing the hard work of protecting and restoring forests via market mechanisms, because we see that it's doing so well. And, I think compliance markets are really great evidence of that. So we're really looking at ways that technology can be used to make it easier for buyers to access higher quality credits. And we think of that as ways that we can arm companies, frankly, with data to help them better understand the benefits and risks associated with these projects, help them visualize what these projects are doing on the ground, and ultimately digitize many of the ways that carbon projects, all of the metrics and factors that carbon projects need in order to be stood up and meet the requirements of methodologies. Let's see if it'll let me, there you go. Okay, so as Aaron mentioned, this is my slide version of that. There's net zero is really becoming the new norm for companies, whether it's public pressure or under compliance or pending compliance for that matter. We see companies making pledges that are pretty ambitious for the next 20 to 30 years. And many of them are looking to natural climate solutions to help them achieve that goal. And year over year, we see forests outperforming in the voluntary offset market across all of the different project types. And we think that trend is increasing. But frankly, more can be done to really harness all of this interest and all of the land that's available today to help the companies meet these targets. Oh, whoa. Sorry, my slides did a funny thing. So what we're doing today is really looking at our value proposition in this space in a few different ways. I think companies are still having some questions around the credibility and quality of forest carbon offsets. I think at the base of that is really, this is a complex space. How do you measure and estimate carbon stocks? And how do you communicate that to folks who are not foresters? The end users of these credits really need to answer to their stakeholders about why they're investing so much money in these projects. And so we really want to harness, satellite data visualization and monitoring capacities to help companies communicate that. We also think there can be ways to kind of modernize the purchase experience a little bit. From my perspective, all of the large companies that we work with, they work with a variety of stakeholders within their own teams. They work with external verification bodies on climate impact reporting, and we want to make it super easy for folks to actually be able to pull that data and communicate what it is that they're doing. At the end of it, we also, because we have all this access to satellite imagery, we really focus on helping highlight all of those important co-benefits that Aaron mentioned about projects in a really easy to access way. So this slide is, I think, a really good example of how we are using technology to communicate about what's happening in the forest. What you see on the left panel under Project A, this red boundary, for example, is a project that we work with, and we're able to see, using historical satellite imagery dating all the way back to 1984, how that forest has changed and performed over time, and what it's doing today. And so you'll see, these patches outside of the project area, it's marking deforestation. And so this is a really great project showing what it's doing to stop illegal deforestation. On the right panel, this is a project that's struggling a bit, frankly, to meet its objectives. And so you'll see deforestation occurring inside the project area on an ongoing basis. The way that we're translating all of this data, what we're doing today is really trying to build up a very robust data pipeline. We pull radar data, satellite imageries, LiDAR scans, and we combine them as well with field plots to really help interpret what all of these little data sets are saying. And we communicate and we translate that into the core, to help answer the core quality questions around carbon credits. So what this looks like is really thinking about our approach in 3 different models. Our historical model is looking at forest performance into the past. And so this helps us understand, project justification as well as baseline setting to communicate carbon additionality. We have a validation model that provides us with present day carbon stock estimates in the forest. and a monitoring model that's looking at forest canopy cover change over time. And so for our monitoring model, we kind of use this actually as almost a early warning system. If we detect, if alerts are triggered and we detect some potential challenges going on in the forest land, we're able to pinpoint that location and share it with landowners and ask them to check out what's going on. Part of why this is so important, Aaron mentioned earlier that many of the projects today in the United States are participating in the compliance program. And part of that is because it's really expensive, frankly, to measure and estimate carbon stocks to the level of accuracy that methodologies require under compliance programs to issue carbon credits. And no matter the size of your project area, you need to do at least probably 300 plots minimum, right? Like Aaron would probably know better, but that means that this market today is a barrier for small landowners. So folks with, probably less than 2,000, 5,000 acres really struggle to participate in this market. And so through this remote sensing approach, we're hoping what it's going to do in the future is really unlock access for some of the family farmers in this country who are, I think, make up nearly 90% of the private land ownership today.
2 minutes, Cindy.
Oh, sure. I will run through this super fast then. So we aggregate all this data. Folks can go online and check out all the projects that are on our website. You can look at every single project and see the results of our model outputs. I'm going to skip this slide and I'll maybe just stop here just to really hone in on that understanding that I think part of the challenge with carbon credits and carbon markets is that it's really difficult for people to understand, the true impact of these projects. And so we do also look at technology and ways that we can highlight and surface, all of the stories behind the hard work that's being done to protect these forests. And I'll stop there since we're a bit out of time and I'm sure folks have lots of questions.
Cindy, thank you very, very much. And I was hesitating whether or not I should interrupt, but I just wanted to, we actually have 3 questions that have come in. And I want to make sure we have some time to answer them because we need to have a hard stop at 11:35. So I'm going to throw the 3 of them out and let the 2 of you respond to them. Related to Jeffrey Houghton question, I have encountered much resistance from colleagues in the environmental community to employing market mechanisms to this end. So in other words, a lot of people that on the one hand want to see nature-based solutions, but when we look at carbon markets and say a corporation coming in and just maybe buying their way out of reducing their carbon emissions, that becomes a concern in the environmental sector if we really want to get to net, zero emissions. And then Benjamin Bartlett asks, any forest carbon calculators that are easy to use? So I don't know, that one could be a great question for both of you. And then Representative Mike Iantachka from Charlotte. I'm sorry if I did not pronounce your name correctly, Mike, but how does normal forest management impact carbon sequestration measurements? For example, select cutting and replanting. How does that piece work once you have either a voluntary or compliance market? So let me open it up to either one that wants to take either one of these, and I'll remind you of the questions.
Sure. I can maybe just start with that first one regarding resistance in the environmental community. We definitely encounter that a lot because I work mostly with corporate voluntary buyers. And I think something to consider here too is even in the voluntary space, when these companies are making net zero pledges, there's a number of guidances out there, like the Science-Based Target Initiative that's run by the World Resources Institute, for example, that are setting pretty stringent guidelines, frankly, on requirements that companies must focus on direct abatement before they can utilize offsets to compensate for their pollution, and in ways that are aligned with IPCC's pathway for achieving net zero in 2050. And us at Pachama, I always encourage our companies, as they're involved in offsets, to really make sure that they have an existing direct abatement plan in place and that they communicate with their stakeholders about the role of offsets within that. And frankly, I think, the sense of urgency on the climate crisis is President Biden, I think on Thursday at this opening for the climate summit, was saying that this is the decisive decade for us to take action. And so it's sort of
Exactly.
time to use all the tools in the toolbox.
Yes, exactly. And I couldn't agree more. But there's a verification process in terms of the carbon markets that are established, in terms of what people are promising they're going to do, and a third party is verifying that that is actually occurring, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
And the third party goes through its own audit at regular intervals. So we've actually had site visits where our foresters are having their measurements checked by a verifier, and then another verifier is checking the verifier. It's a level of scrutiny that's pretty rare in the corporate world in any place.
Yeah, and frankly, part of Pachama's approach, right, we're an additional layer of due diligence on top of that existing process, because I think companies do recognize that they need to be, if they're compensating, they really need to be able to, communicate with data on how these benefits are being quantified.
And then in terms of an easy carbon calculators, I don't know if there's such a thing as an easy carbon calculator, but that's the question. Any forest carbon calculators that are easy to use out there?
Mm-hmm.
Is there some standard? Aaron?
Not really. I'd say for the Northeast, though, if you take the merchantable stocking in quarts per acre and multiply it by 4.5, you have CO2 equivalent.
I know that the Climate Action Reserve offers some quantification tools that are specifically tailored to their protocols, and so folks can certainly check that out. The Vermont Land Trust, I know, also did a pretty comprehensive study with the University of Vermont and Spatial Informatic Groups about 2.5 years ago. They did a pretty comprehensive feasibility analysis on looking at the most attractive parcels in the state be enrolled in carbon programs under a voluntary framework. So those are probably good resources to look at as well.
Great. And then again, on the forest management piece, how is that dealt with, both Aaron and Cindy, within your analysis?
I can take a stab at that. So about 90% of our landowners do some harvesting. And from a carbon sequestration point of view, it's actually pretty important to do that. Just as the silvicultural dynamics work out, the forest soaks up more CO2 if the faster growing, larger trees are given room to grow. So most of our landowners practice some level of selective thinning, and sometimes even a bit more than that. But it's usually of a selective thinning variety, particularly our Western projects that have wildfire risks to contend with. They need to do some fairly active harvest programs to reverse a half century of, frankly, poor land management. So it's usually done, and it's usually value additive.
Okay. So we have exactly 2 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the both of you to tell me, and all of us that are watching this program today, what is the one thing that you think we can do in the legislature, no matter which state it happens to be, in trying to move forward with natural and working lands solutions that we could help to assist in, or maybe work with the executive branch in our state to help this move forward? Aaron? Would it be Reggie?
I'll go to my last slide. Look at Reggie.
Yeah, okay. Look at Reggie.
I'm going to throw something a little bit out of left field, maybe. I was inspired by the last panel, but one thing I think states and probably the federal government can do better is clarity on carbon rights, particularly on areas like ceded lands, for example. Part of why there's limited access for Native American lands to be part of this program is because there's not a lot of clarity on who holds the carbon rights and how the program requirements get enforced and who's responsible for that. And so I think there's a lot to be done, frankly, on coordination with BLM to support that. It's a huge, I think that would be a huge value add for this market.
One other question, do voluntary carbon credit programs encourage innovation to avoid future emissions? Business growth is often a reason for missing emission control targets. How do we reconcile growth in emission controls? Anybody want to take a shot? Or we'll get back to the questioner separately.
I mean, I think there's
All I'll say is that California's GDP has grown faster than the US as a whole. I can't remember the figure over the last 10 years, and its emissions have dropped much faster than the US as a whole, and actually faster than Europe over the same period of time. So I don't think that the argument of we need to increase emissions to increase growth is valid anymore. I think that energy mix and construction and all the things that drive growth are moving toward a more green future anyway.
Yes. Okay. Any additional comments, Cindy?
No, that was great.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you, Aaron, for joining us. This is a huge area, and I think in both your companies with this Bluestone, Pachama. Am I correct? Am I pronouncing that correct, Cindy?
Pachama.
Okay,
And it's
Pachama.
Bluesource.
There you go, in Bluesource.
Got the blue.
Okay. The both of you are going to see major expansion because this is really, really becoming something that everyone at the states starting to focus on. So thank you very much. And to everyone, we're going to take a hard stop now, and we will be back at 11:40. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. Good luck with the conference.